Major funding for this program is made possible by grants from Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and Perfect Building Maintenance, Kilroy Architectural Windows, Inc., New York's Window Company, New York Community Bank, Capital One Bank, Greenberg Traurig, LLP. Additional funding is provided by grants from Akron Gold Brothers, LLC, Briarwood Organization, C.B. Richard Ellis, Cushman & Wakefield, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, First American Title Insurance Company of New York, FRIEDMAN, LLP, GEMINI Real Estate Advisors, LLC, Jack Jaffa and Associates Real Estate Consultants, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Meridian Capital Group, M&T Bank, Muss Development, LLC, the Moynihan Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Orphanides and Associates, SJP Properties, Sterling and Sterling, Stonehenge Partners, Urban American, W Financial Mortgage Fund, the Witkoff Group.
Hello, my name is Michael Stoller. Last week we had this very interesting conversation with regard to this impact of the J51 rent stabilization decontrol apartments, and we are going to continue that discussion today in light of the Peter Cooper Village. My guests today include Gino Martocci, head of all lending for M&T Bank, Robert Knackle, chairman of Massey Knackle Realty Services, Scott Swerdlin, senior vice president, multifamily and commercial lending for Capital One Bank. And needless to say, never last but not least, Ofer Yardeni, managing partner and co-founder of Stonehenge Partners. So, Gino, last week when we were finishing the show, we got to the subject of what effect is this going to have on the securitization market. My friend Ofer Yardeni is one of the people who wants to buy Peter Cooper Village. He's not one. There were hundreds of people who wanted to buy this. Everybody wanted it. Your friends from Canada were there, the Europeans there, and I still remember when I was at Apollo, we had a party. It was the party, you know, in the real estate industry. Once you do a deal, you sometimes give a plaque or you know a tombstone of the ad. And we had this party where the people from the Danish pension plan and some other people, and as opposed to giving the plaque, we gave blank lucite's saying we lost the deal. And in hindsight, I could see them celebrating now, thank God we lost the deal. Because Peter Cooper Village, Stuyvesant Town, sold for $5.4 billion, the highest price ever paid for a multifamily. And there were, you were saying, securitization. The guys who financed this wonderful deal. Let's get to that.
We were really talking about uncertainty and additional uncertainty, not only for portfolio lenders, which I think is, we can understand it, but on the securitization market for the investors. You had two well-known, high-powered law firms provide opinions that the suit on J51 was not going to impede the ability of the new owner to continue to convert the apartments to market. One of the rating agencies, in providing the opinion, quoted these opinions and said that they didn't think that was going to be a problem. So you've had the rating agencies and two well-known firms, the investors relying on the rating agency and two well-known firms to then buy the security, which turned out not to be correct, right? So this only adds to the uncertainty around securitization that's been, very clear over the last 18 months, just the difficulties in that market. And it impedes, I think, the ability to restart the securitization market along with the GGP ruling and other rulings that we've seen.
You bring up a very interesting point. I was reading, I believe it was Commercial Mortgage Alert prior to the show this morning, and I noticed that they were talking about the 3 multifamily transactions in New York that are all near, 2 of them were in foreclosure, and these are all multifamily with securitization. One was the Dorney Day portfolio that the company from England decided that they wanted to buy some crappy apartments on the Upper West Side. Then there was the Rivington, which ironically was built by MetLife at the similar time when Stuyvesant was built up in Harlem. And now you have Peter Cooper Village. So you have 3 transactions, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. And all 3 of these transactions were securitized.
And all 3 were predicated on the idea that you could convert tenants way beyond what historically has been able, that the owners have been able to do, and that rents would increase well beyond sort of historical averages as well. And so all were underwritten on pro formas, all relied on sort of status quo, much more so than turned out to be the case. And as a result,
So now I pose the question to the king of investment sales. You've sold, in your lifetime, you've sold over 1,000 buildings, 1,000 properties. So now you have buildings. Before this case, you were marketing buildings for sale this year. How do you look at it this way today? Are values down? How do you determine how much the building's worth? I mean, people come to you, El Guru of the world. How much is my building worth? I mean, Ofer will tell you he has his own mindset different than you. How do you tell people what it's worth?
Well, Michael, in order to really know, you need to know what the rent on these units in question are going to be, and we won't know specifically what the answer to that is until all the litigation is finalized.
So are you telling me Massinacco is going to go out of business, or you're going to have until you know what the rents are?
It's clear that the rent is going to be reset. There is a range of possibilities for what the rent could be. It could be the existing rent that the tenant is paying, but that tenant just becomes subject to regulation, all the way back to going back to when the unit was last regulated, and a number of different permutations of that. All we're going to do, we're going to make an estimation in terms of what we believe it to be, and we're going to let the investment community decide how they're going to underwrite it. And I think what we're going to find is that the investors that are most risk averse are probably going to have a tough time competing on price with the investors that are going to be a little more aggressive with their underwriting. But I think a very significant point, I want to follow up on what Gino said, is that the uncertainty that this decision has created is going to be another hurdle for the CMBS market to get over. And we need access to public capital very, very badly. The need for refinancing in the commercial real estate market today is such that even if the commercial banking industry and the insurance industry were at full throttle, those industries do not have the capacity to meet the demand for refinancing. We need access to public capital. The CMBS market was a $230 billion market in 2007. In 2008, it was only $12 billion, and all of that occurred in the first 6 months. So since July of 2008, there's been no CMBS issuance, and this is something that's going to create another tremendous deterrent to getting that engine started again, and we need that very badly.
Now, you talk about the collateralized mortgage-backed security for my audience, which was what Wall Street would take these mortgages and securitize and then sell, slice and dice and put them together. Let's talk about, I've purposely brought 2 banks who continue to lend in today's market. What about the other banks who who really don't know with the uncertainty? You have 19 major major money center banks. Many of them were never really in the multifamily market. I mean,
no, Michael, but there's still tremendous activity in the multifamily lending arena. The community banks are still very active, very healthy, from what we understand.
Do you think Fannie and Freddie, who've provided a lot of the loans, especially to you this year, they gave you a loan for $152 million on your property, which is a class property. I love the Ritz. Do you think that in light of this lawsuit, how is Fannie and Freddie going to look at this? I mean, this is uncertainty, right? We haven't posed that. We went to you as a regular banker, you as a regular banker. Now I'm bringing into consideration. He's a governmental agency.
Well,
what do we do?
Michael, it happens to be the 2 parts of Fannie and Freddie that were never broken and that remained healthy. And just getting back to some of the things that Bob talked about and Gino, I think going forward, we're just going to have to take a harder look at the rent roll for buildings that are affected by this, how many units in the building are affected by the J51 have been decontrolled. There are over 2,000. J51 is still in effect. And then decide on how much risk as a lender we want to take. Perhaps we'll just be a little bit more conservative if we want to make a loan on that type of situation.
I think, I mean, you talked about more aggressive investors are going to win the property. The issue is, I think, for the banks, they're going to take the most conservative approach to a particular unit and a particular rent roll. And so it's going to create even a slightly larger financing gap than already exists. And I think it just compounds the problem.
You should look conservatively. What that's going to do is require additional equity. Because if you're going to lend less, more equity is required. Equity is more expensive than debt is, so theoretically that's going to have a negative impact on value.
And value, exactly.
But even in today's market, Gino, when you look at a property on a multifamily, you don't lend more than 60% loan to value.
Oh, we'll do more than 60% on a multifamily. Sure we will.
Maybe I should be a borrower at your bank, but based on the quotes that I'm getting, I am more at around 50% loan to value.
Depends on whose value we're talking about.
No,
on a purchase price, that's what I'm talking on, a purchase price that you are looking.
What is value today? That is my big question. What is value? I mean, at one time people were buying based on a capitalization rate. They were buying on a rent, multiple of rent. What is the value? I mean, that is the big question. It's not 60% the value or something like that. How are you going to look at value? How are Fannie and Freddie Mac going to look at values when they look at deals? Sometimes it's easier just to put your head in the mud. I'm not saying the two of you will, but I'm pretty certain that certain lenders and certain government agencies are going to say, hey, as you said, two prominent law firms, securitization, Moody's, all these people had no problem.
No, but Michael, the fact is there's no empirical formula to determine value. It's all what the market will bear. And so as we sit here today, we can't answer that question. But hopefully over 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, once there are a couple of transactions that occur on buildings that are subject to these units in question, then we'll start to get a sense of how the market is interpreting it. If Ofer bids the same thing today that he was prepared to bid 3 weeks ago, then
Ofer is
the impact is very little.
Ofer is a sophisticated purchaser. It's a different case. Unfortunately, there are plenty of people who say, we were talking about this prior to the show, there are young guys who maybe want to change jobs, they want to go into this business, maybe they're able to get some funds from some friends to buy a property. They have the desire to own a piece of New York, the same way that Ofer did when he came over from Israel. What happens with these people? What's their value? What's the value?
I think that they are definitely going to pay more than we are going to pay. And I think that then when they'll come to Gino is not going to lend them as much as they need to, because they would like to buy these properties. But when we look at the deal to buy, we don't look at the cap rate as Bob is mentioning or the NOI, because we know that the NOI that we are getting from the brokerage community is not necessarily the right NOI, and the banks are not looking at it in the same way like that.
Are you saying that his numbers that he has provided you may have certain discrepancies in what you're underwriting
I'm
with?
saying that we have the cost of running a property a lot higher than what Bob is providing.
You do a little more, more due diligence.
So we look at it more as a price per square foot, price per unit, what's the average rent in the building. We don't buy NOI. NOI is just a number that people are throwing, but we look at, yes.
Can I ask a question with regard, we discussed last week, J51s, which is a tax abatement, which I believe was a 15-year tax abatement?
It's typically 12 to 15.
12 to 15 years. We didn't discuss last week something called the MCI, the Major Capital Improvement. What is it? Why, if I'm an owner, which you are, we've gone, why would somebody prefer to do a J51, for my audience, I know the answer, but I'm not asking, a J51 as opposed to an MCI?
I think with the MCI is a pass-through that you pass to the tenant to increase the rent, versus the J51 is in order to reduce your real estate taxes. There's a lot of occasions where the market you cannot absorb, the tenants will not pay the increase of the rent, so you can't pass it to him because he's already paying at market. So therefore, if you are applying for a J51, you get the benefit from the city in real estate taxes. So this is why people are applying for it.
But when someone might come and we said prior show, somebody may have financed. You may have financed the J51s. Have you ever financed the MCI, the major capital improvements?
Well, I think, some of the things that have happened over the past 5 years was based on MCI increases, aspirational cash flows, pro forma, that, the rents were going to increase. You talked about Riverton, and that's exactly, what happened there. But they didn't get the increases that they thought they were going to get. They didn't get the turnover of the units with rent stabilizing tenants vacating the units.
Let's give a little bit to Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village. At one time there was a list to get on the list to get an apartment, and then when it was destabilized, by MetLife when they put some money in, because for years they hadn't done anything, and then it was like 1996, maybe 1998. Then the apartments went up to, let's say, $2,000 for a 2-bedroom. Then as soon as Tishman Speyer, BlackRock took it over, that $2,000 rent went to $4,000. Now, were these correct rents? I mean, what's the right rent, Ofer? How do you make a determination what the right rent is? How do you look at it if it's a decontrolled property?
I think the right rent is what the tenant is willing to pay. That's, to me, is the right rent. Tishman did not force anybody to live in this area and twist their arm, come and live and pay $3,000 or $4,000. On the contrary, what Tishman did, they did a great job there. They renovated their buildings. And I don't know when was the last time you went there, but I was there last week.
I was there.
And I think that Tishman was the perfect owner for this development. They did a beautiful gym.
What they did in there,
they enhanced the property.
They enhanced the property. The property looks completely different. The retail looks different. I mean, they've made it a major difference. But they put capital into it,
of course.
as opposed to a number of people who've come to you, who buy properties. I mean, unfortunately, in the 2006, 2005, 6, and 7, I mean, people came, and how fast did you sell property? I mean,
the transaction period was very, very short.
So how much due diligence really was in there?
Well, people did a lot of due diligence, but they did it in a very short period of time because they had to in order to be competitive.
They didn't worry about a financing contingency. They didn't care if they had Gino or Scott to do it. They just said, I'll buy it.
No, financing contingencies are never really a very prevalent thing in our marketplace, good times or bad. Right? I think one of the big issues about the Stuytown decision is who really is the victim? Who's the victim here? If a unit became decontrolled and a tenant said, okay, the rent is $4,000 a month. I'm willing to pay $4,000 a month. I can afford to pay it. I'm willing to do it. Nobody's twisting my arm. Is it right that tenant who's making probably $250,000 gets a check for $50,000 or $60,000 because of the result of this? It's a very, very interesting thing to see how the court is going to determine what damages are and what rents are going to be set at, because the true victim would be anybody who was displaced because of this, because of units going to free market, or the general tenant in the marketplace who was not able to rent a unit at a lower than market rent because it went to market. They were eliminated from having the opportunity to buy that apartment, but that's not a quantifiable thing.
And I don't think that people were displaced from Stuyvesant. I want to make it clear that I believe that the people who left either because there were illegal tenants in those units, they occupied it, they sublet it, and they give somebody money and they were found as tenants that are subletting, or tenants that got paid by the landlord in order to vacate. It wasn't like any major tactics that Tishman handled.
I agree with you.
I mean, let's look at it in the right way.
I think what Bob is bringing out is, there were 9 tenants in this lawsuit. Now, these were tenants who have probably been there for years. I mean, the average, before MetLife did work in the 1990s, people lived in Stuytown for 20, 30 years. Certain people were there for 40 years. And as you know, in getting an apartment destabilized, once you had a stabilized apartment in New York City, you didn't give it up. Yeah. I mean, you didn't want to ever give up this apartment.
No, Michael,
and you would fight every conceivable way. I never made $175,000. No, I didn't do that. I mean, I know people, I remember one person, I said, how are you living in that apartment? He says, oh, each year I asked my accountant to change my numbers. I mean, there were every conceivable way.
No, Michael, I'm not disagreeing with Ofer, and I agree that Tishman has done everything by the book the right way. They didn't intention or maliciously displace anybody. What I'm talking about is a tenant who may have had their legal rent go to $2,100, and they said, you know what, I could afford to pay $2,100, but I can't afford to pay the $4,000 that's the market rent. That person may have left because
but I'm
of this.
confused,
But that's
Bob.
a
I'm
very,
confused
very
because it
small
doesn't make
percentage
sense.
of
If
people.
his rent stabilized at 19, and if his rent is 2 or 4% a year, and if he's not making above 175,000, he can stay there
No, I'm
forever.
assuming they're making above the 170.
But there's a
Okay,
reverse
so-
incentives, right? So it's really affluent
Yes.
tenants that are being rewarded.
Right.
At the
It
cost
That
of
is
the-
exactly what
That's
Bob
my
is
point.
saying.
Absolutely,
That's my
I
point.
get it,
So the
yeah.
point is, where is the court going to go with this decision? And meanwhile, while the court is figuring out what the new rent's going to be and who the right tenant is and who's going to receive this benefit, the market is in a state of uncertainty, which creates some problems that we didn't have. And one of the things we talked about last week was the fact that the market was operating under a set of rules that were very clear, that were ratified and endorsed by DHCR, that were ratified and endorsed by HPD. And now all of a sudden, because of this court decision, the rules have gone out the window. That's the biggest travesty in this decision, is that for a market to operate properly, you need transparency, you need reliability, you need to know what the rules are. You can't go into a game and have the rules change in the middle of the game. It's very debilitating for the marketplace, and that's exactly what's happening.
Now here's the question for the lenders. You have dual headquarters. You have Manhattan and you have Buffalo. You have Manhattan and you have Virginia. Now, there are people in Buffalo, there are people in Virginia, there are people who are on your board and they're investors, and they're going to ask you, because as you said, every newspaper, everything has been writing about this. How are you going to make loans on this, Gino? How's Capital One going to, and how are you going to answer that question?
Well, we've talked about this last week. We've done a lot of analysis about our portfolio to understand where we have J51 buildings that are in the J51 program, and then we went unit by unit to see what the impact was. Now we don't know exactly what the cash flow impact is going to be.
My question is, you have a board of directors, you're publicly held companies, both of you. How do you think, sometimes, as I said prior in the past, sometimes there are banks who said, I really don't care about it. It's not the major business. It was a big business at Capital One in the past. It's a major business in New York Community Bank. It was never a Bank of America business. How do you think a number of players who are going to walk away from financing of multifamily, or are they going to change their underwriting significantly?
I don't think anybody's going to walk away from it. I think that when we are underwriting situations that are affected by this, just take a more conservative approach to it. Ofer likes to think that we only lend 60%. We like to think we lend 75% loan to value. Perhaps in those situations we will go back. Maybe we only do 60%. But I think Bob hit it on the head. There's so much uncertainty. How is it going to go roll back? You think back in the mid-'90s when some housing cooperatives were foreclosed on by banks, and the state had to make a decision that these people who had equity in their apartments were now going to become renters. Well, what rent were they going to pay? Was it a rent-stabilized unit prior to the conversion? The Mitchell-Lama program, buildings are taken out of Mitchell-Lama when the bonds are paid off. Well, does that rent become the new rent-stabilized rent? You know how many years, Mike, it took them to finally figure this stuff out?
The discussion in the Mitchell-Lama, I was about to bring it up, but that's a major situation. Now,
And that's a major problem, too, and I'll explain the same way that this decision creates uncertainty in the marketplace and undermines the set of guidelines. Think about this, that you're a developer. Let's say you want to build a building, and the city says, we're going to give you a certain benefit for building the building because we want you to create this affordable housing. You stay in the program for X number of years and then you get out. And then at the X number of years comes and you say, oh, well, we were just kidding. Now we want the building to stay in the program because we as the city can't figure out how to create the affordable housing that's so desperately needed, so we're going to rely on taking property from the private sector in order to fulfill that need. That is a terrible precedent to set, and I'm surprised at the position that many politicians have taken in saying that they want to keep Mitchell-Lama buildings in the program. That's like telling a criminal goes to jail for 30 years, and right as he's about to get out, he says, oh, we were just kidding. It wasn't 30 years. You have to stay in for 50. How are you ever going to get the private sector to create more affordable housing, to create jobs, to do things based upon guidelines and rules that are established today if you're going to change them down the line? That is the biggest problem. You have to have certainty in order to allow commerce to function and allow transactions to occur. And it's the same premise with the Mitchell-Lama buildings.
I hear you very loud and clear, and I don't think that the change that even the politicians that are taking today, and there are changes that they are trying to do every month that we don't know the direction. I mean, we all knew that it's a gray area. We thought it's a gray area. I mean, the fact is that there's a lot of buildings that decided to go and to do the renovation and not to apply for the J51. So there was a little bit suspicious among certain owners. And I think that, Bob, being in the United States and working in New York, I think that we still have here law and order. And in fact, today we have new election for a mayor, and hopefully the right mayor will win. And he is a businessman, and maybe he will step up, and maybe he will try to push with the court and with city council and with the governor to make this issue go away sooner than later, as still United States is law and order, and people from all over the world come to invest here because they feel comfortable.
I wish I had another hour, but we spent already an hour on this. I think that I purposely did the show on this subject. I am really happy that you've been with me for the past 2 weeks. I'd like to thank Gino Martocci, Robert Knackel, Scott Swerdlin, and Ofer Yerdeni. Next week, we'll get off the subject of Mitchell-Lama, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Major funding for this program is made possible by grants from Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and Perfect Building Maintenance, Kilroy Architectural Windows, Inc., New York's Window Company, New York Community Bank, Capital One Bank, Greenberg Traurig, LLP. Additional funding is provided by grants from Akron Gold Brothers, LLC, Briarwood Organization, C.B. Richard Ellis, Cushman and Wakefield, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, First American Title Insurance Company of New York, FRIEDMAN, LLP, GEMINI Real Estate Advisors, LLC, Jack Jaffa and Associates Real Estate Consultants, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knackel Realty Services, Meridian Capital Group, M&T Bank, Muss Development, LLC, Des Moines Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Orphanides and Associates, SJP Properties, Sterling and Sterling, Stonehenge Partners, Urban American, W Financial Mortgage Fund, the Wickoff Group.